In the shadowed corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, where marble statues cast long shadows across cold stone floors, Niccolò Machiavelli sat hunched over his wooden desk, his quill scratching against parchment as he penned what would become the most controversial treatise on power ever written. The year was 1513, and the man who had once served as secretary to the Second Chancery of the Republic of Florence was now in exile, stripped of his position, tortured, and left to contemplate the brutal realities of political survival he had witnessed firsthand. The candle beside him flickered, casting dancing shadows across the pages of what would become Il Principe, the Prince. With each stroke of his pen, Machiavelli was not merely writing a guide for rulers, he was dissecting the very essence of human nature, laying bare the uncomfortable truths that civilized society preferred to keep hidden behind veils of morality and righteousness. His words would echo through the centuries, earning him both reverence and revulsion, as he dared to speak what others only whispered in the darkest corners of their minds. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, he wrote, his withered fingers gripping the quill with the intensity of a man who understood that ideas could be more dangerous than swords. For everyone can see and few can feel. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. These words encapsulated the first and, perhaps most fundamental of his dark teachings, that in the realm of power, perception is reality, and reality is whatever the strong make it to be. Machiavelli's genius lay not in his invention of ruthless tactics, these had existed since the first human picked up a stone against another, but, in his unflinching documentation of them, his systematic approach to understanding how power actually works rather than how idealistic philosophers claimed it should work. He had seen the rise and fall of the Borgias, witnessed the machinations of Pope Alexander VI, observed the brutal efficiency of Cesare Borgia's campaigns, and understood that those who succeeded in gaining and maintaining power did so not through adherence to Christian virtues, but through a calculated blend of cunning, force, and strategic cruelty. The first part of his darkest teaching centers on what he termed the necessity of being feared rather than loved. This was not a recommendation born from misanthropy, but from cold observation. In the courts and battlefields of Renaissance Italy, Machiavelli had seen beloved leaders deposed by those they trusted, watched as kindness was interpreted as weakness, and observed how quickly the fickle affections of the masses could turn. Love, he understood, was conditional and volatile, fear was reliable and enduring. Consider the case of Oliverado da Fermo, whose story Machiavelli recounted with clinical precision. This young man, raised by his uncle Giovanni Fogliani, returned to his hometown after years of military service under Paolo Vitelli. Rather than showing gratitude for his uncle's care, Oliverado invited his uncle and other leading citizens to a grand banquet. Once the feast was underway and trust had been established, Oliverado's soldiers surrounded the dining hall and systematically murdered every potential rival to his authority. Within hours, he had transformed himself from a returning nephew into the undisputed lord of Fermo. This example, Machiavelli wrote, shows how little reliance can be placed upon the friendships which are gained by payments, and not by greatness of soul. Oliverado's success was not an aberration but a demonstration of fundamental principles. He understood that power vacuums cannot exist in nature, they will be filled, and it is better to fill them yourself than to hope others will do so benevolently. The massacre at the banquet was not an act of random violence but a surgical strike that eliminated opposition in a single, decisive moment. The brilliance of Oliverado's approach lay in its comprehensiveness. He did not merely kill his uncle, he eliminated the entire power structure that could have challenged him. Half measures in the acquisition of power, Machiavelli observed, were worse than no measures at all. Men ought either to be well treated or crushed, he wrote, because they can avenge themselves of lighter injuries, of more serious ones they cannot, therefore the injury that is to be done to a man ought to be of such a kind that one does not stand in fear of revenge. This principle extends far beyond the bloody politics of Renaissance Italy. In the modern corporate world, hostile takeovers follow similar patterns. A company seeking to acquire another does not gradually purchase shares while announcing its intentions, it accumulates positions quietly, then strikes decisively when it has the power to succeed. The target company's management is not given the opportunity to mount an effective defense because the acquiring company understands Machiavelli's lesson: opposition that is weakened but not destroyed will reorganize and strike back with greater determination. The second fundamental teaching in Machiavelli's dark philosophy concerns the strategic use of cruelty. He distinguished between cruelty that is well used and cruelty that is badly used. Well-used cruelty is applied once, decisively, and serves a clear strategic purpose.
Badly used cruelty is continuous, random, or excessive, creating more enemies than it eliminates.
This distinction reveals the calculating nature of Machiavellian thought. Even in the application of violence, there must be method, purpose, and restraint. The exemplar of well-used cruelty in Machiavelli's analysis was Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Romagna, whose campaigns Machiavelli had observed personally during his diplomatic missions. When Borgia conquered the Romagna region, he faced a territory that had been ravaged by weak rulers and petty tyrants. The people suffered under a patchwork of competing authorities, none strong enough to provide order, all strong enough to inflict suffering. Borgia's solution was characteristically brutal and effective. He appointed Ramiro de Orco as his deputy, a man known for his exceptional cruelty and efficiency. De Orco was given unlimited authority to pacify the region, which he did through a campaign of systematic violence against bandits, corrupt officials, and anyone who challenged the new order. Within months, the Romagna was transformed from a lawless wasteland into a prosperous, orderly province. Roads that had been impassable became safe for merchants, courts that had been corrupt began dispensing justice, taxes that had been ignored were collected fairly and used for public works. But Borgia understood that the very cruelty that had created order would eventually turn the people against him if it continued. In a masterstroke of political theater, he had de Orco arrested, tried, and executed, displaying his severed body in the public square. The message was clear: the harsh measures had been necessary, but they were now ended. The people's resentment was focused on the dead deputy rather than the living duke, and Borgia emerged as both the architect of order and the protector of the people from excessive cruelty. This action, Machiavelli wrote, gave satisfaction to the people and kept them in suspense. The cruelty of this spectacle left the people at once satisfied and dismayed. The psychological sophistication of this maneuver reveals the depth of Machiavellian thinking. Borgia had not simply used violence, he had choreographed it, controlling not just the physical outcome but the emotional and psychological response of his subjects. The modern application of this principle can be seen in corporate restructuring. When a new CEO takes control of a struggling company, they often implement massive layoffs, budget cuts, and operational changes within their first year. These measures are painful and create significant hardship for employees and communities. However, effective leaders understand that it is better to inflict this pain quickly and comprehensively rather than to drag it out over years of gradual decline. Once the restructuring is complete, the CEO can focus on growth and positive initiatives, and the earlier pain becomes associated with the previous leadership or market conditions rather than with the new regime. The third pillar of Machiavellian darkness addresses the fundamental unreliability of human nature. Men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities, he observed, that he who seeks to deceive will always find someone who will allow himself to be deceived. This was not cynicism for its own sake, but a practical recognition that successful leadership requires understanding people as they are, not as we wish they were. Machiavelli had witnessed the spectacular rise and fall of Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar who had briefly transformed Florence into a theocratic state through the sheer force of his charismatic preaching. Savonarola had convinced the Florentines to burn their luxuries in the bonfire of the vanities, to abandon their traditional festivities, and to embrace an austere form of Christianity that promised salvation through suffering. For 4 years, this unarmed prophet ruled through nothing but the power of his words and the strength of his conviction. But conviction, Machiavelli observed, was not enough. When Pope Alexander VI excommunicated Savonarola and threatened Florence with interdiction, when the people grew weary of austerity and longed for their former pleasures, when rival preachers began to challenge his interpretations of Scripture, Savonarola had no response except more sermons. He had built his power on the shifting foundation of popular enthusiasm rather than on the solid bedrock of force and self-interest. When the enthusiasm faded, as enthusiasm always does, he found himself defenseless. The mob that had once hung on his every word now dragged him to the same square where the bonfires of vanities had burned and executed him as a heretic. Unarmed prophets, Machiavelli concluded, have always been defeated. The lesson was clear: human nature is fundamentally unreliable, driven by immediate desires and fears rather than by long-term commitments or abstract principles. Those who build their power on appeals to higher nature are building on quicksand. This understanding of human fickleness extends to what Machiavelli called the nature of the multitude. The masses, he observed, are easily swayed by appearances, quick to embrace new leaders when times are hard, and equally quick to abandon them when circumstances improve. They remember injuries longer than benefits, fear change less than they fear loss, and will always choose the immediate over the delayed, the certain over the uncertain, the simple over the complex. A prince who understands this can manipulate it to his advantage. By controlling the flow of information, by timing announcements for maximum impact, by associating himself with popular symbols and causes while distancing himself from unpopular ones, a skilled leader can guide public opinion as a shepherd guides his flock. But this requires constant vigilance, because the same fickleness that allows for manipulation also makes the masses fundamentally unreliable allies. The corporate world provides countless examples of this principle in action. Companies spend billions on marketing and public relations not because their products have changed, but because they understand that public perception is more important than objective reality. A data breach that affects millions of customers can be forgotten within months if properly managed, while a minor customer service incident can destroy a company's reputation if it goes viral on social media. The masses are indeed fickle, and wise leaders plan accordingly. As Machiavelli delved deeper into his analysis, he confronted what perhaps represented his most controversial teaching, the deliberate abandonment of conventional morality in favor of what he termed virtue, a concept that has no direct translation but encompasses effectiveness, adaptability, and the willingness to do whatever circumstances require. This was not virtue in the Christian sense of adherence to divine commandments, nor virtue in the classical sense of excellence of character. This was virtue as pure pragmatism, the ability to act decisively without being constrained by moral squeamishness or idealistic notions of how the world should work. Everyone sees what you appear to be, he wrote, few experience what you really are, and those few dare not oppose the opinion of the many, who have the majesty of the state to defend them. This observation cut to the heart of his teaching about the dual nature of successful leadership. A prince must maintain the appearance of conventional virtues, mercy, faithfulness, humanity, religion, integrity, while being prepared to act contrary to these virtues whenever circumstances demand it. The key insight here is that morality, as traditionally understood, is a luxury that only the powerless can afford. Those who hold responsibility for the welfare of states, organizations, or large groups of people cannot indulge in moral purity when such indulgence would lead to greater suffering for those they lead. The prince who refuses to order a tactical retreat because it seems cowardly will see his army destroyed, the leader who will not lie to protect state secrets will see his nation conquered, the executive who cannot fire unproductive employees because it seems cruel will watch the entire company fail, destroying jobs for everyone. This principle found its most disturbing expression in Machiavelli's discussion of faith and promise-keeping. A wise lord, he wrote, cannot, nor ought he to, keep faith when such observance may be turned against him, and when the reasons that caused him to pledge it exist no longer. To modern ears, this sounds like an endorsement of pure relativism, a rejection of the very foundations of trust upon which civilization depends. But Machiavelli's argument was more subtle and more troubling than simple relativism. He pointed out that in a world where others routinely break their promises when it suits them, the leader who always keeps his word is not noble but naive. He will be systematically exploited by those who understand that his moral constraints can be used against him. Like the player who insists on following the rules in a game where everyone else is cheating, the moral prince will find himself not just losing, but enabling the victory of less scrupulous opponents who will likely prove far worse rulers than he would have been. The example Machiavelli provided was that of Pope Alexander VI, whom he described as a man who did nothing else but deceive men, and never lacked the opportunity of doing so. Alexander's entire career was built on broken promises, forged documents, and strategic betrayals. Yet he consistently succeeded in his objectives, expanded papal power, and died in his bed rather than on a scaffold. Meanwhile, those who trusted him and expected him to honor his commitments found themselves impoverished, exiled, or dead. Therefore, Machiavelli concluded, it is unnecessary for a prince to have all the good qualities I have enumerated, but it is very necessary to appear to have them. And I shall dare to say this also, that to have them and always observe them is injurious, and that to appear to have them is useful, to appear merciful, faithful, humane, religious, upright, and to be so, but with a mind so framed that should you require not to be so, you may be able and know how to change to the opposite. This teaching strikes at the very foundation of moral philosophy and social order. If everyone followed Machiavelli's advice, if every leader operated on the principle that promises could be broken whenever convenient, society would collapse into a war of all against all. But Machiavelli's point was precisely that not everyone would or could follow this advice. Most people are constrained by genuine moral convictions, by social pressures, by lack of imagination, or by simple cowardice. The prince who understands this has an enormous advantage over those who do not. The second phase of Machiavelli's darkest teachings delves into what he called the art of war, not merely the conduct of military campaigns, but the understanding that all politics is fundamentally about conflict, that peace is simply war conducted by other means, and that the leader who forgets this will find himself conquered by those who remember it. This was perhaps his most prescient insight, anticipating by centuries the observations of Karl von Clausewitz that war is politics continued by other means. In the turbulent landscape of Renaissance Italy, where city-states rose and fell like flowers in a storm, Machiavelli observed that the fundamental unit of political organization was not the individual citizen but the armed group. Treaties were worth nothing without the force to enforce them, laws were meaningless without the power to punish violations, rights existed only insofar as someone was willing and able to defend them. The prince who neglected military matters would inevitably find his state absorbed by neighbors who understood that power grows from the barrel of a gun. But Machiavelli's conception of warfare extended far beyond the battlefield. He understood that economic competition, diplomatic maneuvering, and even cultural influence were forms of warfare conducted under different rules but with the same ultimate goal, the imposition of one's will upon others. The merchant who undersold his competitors was engaged in economic warfare, the diplomat who negotiated favorable terms was conducting political warfare, the priest who converted populations was waging spiritual warfare. This understanding led to what might be considered his most cynical teaching, that alliances are temporary conveniences, that today's ally is tomorrow's enemy, and that the wise prince maintains sufficient strength to stand alone when circumstances change. He had witnessed the collapse of the League of Cambrai, where European powers allied against Venice only to immediately turn on each other once their initial objective was achieved. He had seen how quickly French support for Florence evaporated when it became inconvenient, how readily papal allies became papal enemies when the balance of power shifted. The nature of peoples, he observed, is variable, and, whilst it is easy to persuade them, it is difficult to fix them in that persuasion. This variability extended to international relations, where shifts in leadership, changes in economic conditions, or new military technologies could transform the strategic landscape overnight. The prince who built his security on assumptions of permanent alliance was building on shifting sand. The practical implications of this teaching were profound. A state needed to maintain sufficient military capability to defend itself without relying on external assistance. It needed to develop economic independence, or at least diversified dependence, so that no single trading partner could strangle it through embargo. It needed to cultivate multiple diplomatic relationships, always keeping open the possibility of new alliances while never trusting completely in existing ones. This principle found its most elegant expression in Machiavelli's analysis of mercenary forces. The Italian city-states of his era had largely abandoned citizen militias in favor of hired professional soldiers, believing this to be more efficient and less disruptive to civilian life. The condottieri who led these mercenary companies were skilled military entrepreneurs who offered their services to the highest bidder. On the surface, this seemed like an ideal solution: professional military capability without the social disruption of universal conscription. But Machiavelli identified fatal flaws in this system. Mercenaries, he argued, had fundamentally different incentives than citizen soldiers. They fought for pay, not for principle. They sought to minimize casualties among their own men rather than maximize damage to the enemy. They had no long-term stake in the territories they defended. Most dangerously, they could be bribed, subverted, or simply hired away by enemy powers at crucial moments. Mercenaries and auxiliaries are useless and dangerous, he wrote. If one holds his state based on these arms, he will stand neither firm nor safe, for they are disunited, ambitious, without discipline, without loyalty. The proof of this came in the form of countless betrayals and military disasters that had befallen Italian states relying on hired forces. At the Battle of Anghiari, mercenary armies fought for hours without a single death because neither side wanted to suffer casualties that would reduce their value in future conflicts. The alternative Machiavelli proposed was a return to citizen militias, not because citizen soldiers were necessarily better fighters than professionals, but because they had skin in the game. They were defending their own homes, their own families, their own futures. They could not simply walk away when conditions became difficult, nor could they be easily bribed to change sides. Their loyalty was secured not by contractual obligation but by existential necessity. This teaching has profound implications for modern organizational theory. Companies that rely too heavily on contractors and consultants, governments that outsource critical functions to private companies, institutions that depend on external expertise rather than developing internal capability, all are vulnerable to the same dynamics that destroyed the Italian city-states. When push comes to shove, hired help has different incentives than stakeholders, and those different incentives can prove fatal in crisis situations. The economic dimension of Machiavellian warfare reveals another layer of his dark wisdom. He understood that prosperity could be as dangerous to a state as poverty, but for different reasons. Prosperity bred complacency, softness, and internal division over how to distribute wealth. It attracted the attention of poorer neighbors who saw successful states as opportunities for plunder. It created dependencies on trade routes and foreign markets that could be disrupted by hostile powers. Poverty does not prevent the attainment of any rank, he observed, nor does wealth secure it. This was not merely a moral observation about the meaninglessness of material possessions, but a strategic insight about the relationship between economic conditions and military capability. Poor populations might be easier to motivate for war, since they had less to lose and more to gain from successful conquest. Wealthy populations might have superior equipment and supplies, but they also had more to protect and thus more reason to avoid risks. The optimal condition for a state, in Machiavelli's analysis, was moderate prosperity combined with strong institutions and citizen engagement. Enough wealth to provide for effective government and military capability, but not so much as to breed corruption and complacency. A broad distribution of property that gave many citizens a stake in defending the system, but not such complete equality as to remove incentives for individual achievement. This economic analysis led to some of his most controversial policy recommendations. He advocated for sumptuary laws that limited ostentatious displays of wealth, not out of moral concern about inequality but because such displays bred resentment among the poor and made the state appear weaker to foreign observers. He supported public works projects that provided employment and demonstrated state capability, but opposed excessive taxation that would impoverish the productive classes. He favored trade policies that strengthened domestic industries rather than those that maximized short-term profits for merchants. The underlying principle was that economic policy should serve political ends rather than vice versa. The goal was not to maximize prosperity in some abstract sense, but to create the conditions under which the state could survive and thrive in a competitive international environment. This meant sometimes sacrificing economic efficiency for strategic security, sometimes choosing domestic production over cheaper imports, sometimes accepting lower growth rates in exchange for greater social stability. As Machiavelli's analysis progressed into its third and most disturbing phase, he confronted what he saw as the ultimate truth about human nature and political organization, that civilization itself is merely a thin veneer over fundamental savagery, and that successful leaders must understand and manipulate this savagery rather than attempting to transcend it. This was not a counsel of despair but a recognition of reality, a call for leaders to work with human nature as it exists rather than as philosophers imagine it should be. The foundation of this insight lay in his observation of what he called the two natures of leadership. A prince, he argued, must be prepared to act both as a man and as a beast, understanding when to employ reason and diplomacy and when to resort to force and deception. Since a prince must know how to use the beast, he wrote, he ought to choose the fox and the lion, because the lion cannot defend himself against snares and the fox cannot defend himself against wolves. Therefore, it is necessary to be a fox to discover the snares and a lion to terrify the wolves. This metaphor of the fox and the lion encapsulated centuries of political wisdom in a few words. The lion represented pure force, the ability to intimidate opponents, crush resistance, and impose one's will through superior strength. But force alone was insufficient, because clever opponents could set traps that strength could not break, could use the lion's own power against him through misdirection and manipulation. Hence the need for the fox's cunning, the ability to detect deception, to think several moves ahead, to win through intelligence rather than through brute force. But even more unsettling was Machiavelli's recognition that both the lion and the fox were fundamentally predatory animals. The choice was not between noble leadership and base manipulation, but between different forms of predation. The question was not whether to exploit others, but how to do so most effectively while maintaining the stability necessary for long-term success. This teaching found its most disturbing expression in his analysis of popular leadership. The prince who wished to maintain power, he observed, must cultivate the support of the common people while simultaneously keeping them under control. This required a sophisticated understanding of mass psychology, of the fears and desires that motivated large groups, of the techniques by which public opinion could be shaped and directed. The masses, in Machiavelli's analysis, were like a powerful but dangerous animal that could be ridden by a skilled master but would devour an incompetent one. They possessed enormous energy and could accomplish remarkable feats when properly directed, but they were also volatile, unpredictable, and capable of sudden turns that could destroy everything in their path. The successful prince learned to harness this energy while protecting himself from its destructive potential. One key technique was what Machiavelli called giving the people something to hope for and something to fear. Hope alone made people complacent and demanding, fear alone made them desperate and rebellious. But the combination of hope and fear created a psychological state where people remained engaged and motivated while being reluctant to take actions that might jeopardize their prospects. The carrot and the stick had to be carefully balanced, with both always visible but neither completely predictable. Another technique involved the strategic use of scapegoats and external enemies. When internal tensions arose, when economic conditions deteriorated, when social problems seemed intractable, the wise prince redirected popular anger toward external targets or internal minorities who could be safely attacked without damaging the fundamental power structure. This was not merely cynical manipulation but recognition of a psychological reality, that human groups seem to require enemies to maintain their cohesion, and that it is better to choose these enemies strategically rather than allow them to emerge randomly. The most sophisticated aspect of this popular manipulation involved what Machiavelli called the circulation of elites. He observed that every society contained ambitious individuals who sought to rise above their current station, and that these individuals represented both an opportunity and a threat to established authority. If their ambitions were completely frustrated, they would become centers of opposition and rebellion. If they were allowed to advance too easily, they would displace existing leaders and potentially destabilize the entire system. The solution was to create controlled channels for advancement that allowed the most talented and ambitious individuals to improve their positions while ensuring their continued dependence on the existing power structure. This might involve military service that offered opportunities for glory and promotion, commercial ventures that could create wealth but required state protection, or administrative positions that provided status and influence while keeping their holders under close supervision. By carefully managing these advancement opportunities, a prince could ensure that the most dangerous potential opponents became instead his most valuable supporters. They would have achieved enough success to satisfy their immediate ambitions while remaining dependent on the system for their continued prosperity. They would have too much to lose to risk rebellion while having enough to gain to maintain their motivation and energy. This principle extended to what Machiavelli called the management of factions. Every society, he observed, naturally divided into competing groups based on interests, ideologies, geographical origins, or simple personal loyalties. These factions were inherently dangerous because they created alternative centers of power that could challenge central authority. But they were also inevitable and could not be eliminated through force or persuasion. The wise prince therefore learned to balance factions against each other, ensuring that no single group became powerful enough to challenge his authority while preventing any group from being completely destroyed and, thus having nothing left to lose. This required constant attention and frequent adjustments, as the relative strength of factions shifted over time due to economic changes, generational transitions, or external events. The technique involved playing factions off against each other while maintaining the appearance of neutrality, providing benefits to each group while ensuring that these benefits created dependencies rather than independence, and occasionally shifting support from one faction to another to prevent any from becoming too confident of continued favor. It was an exhausting and morally corrosive process, but Machiavelli argued it was the only alternative to civil war and social collapse. The international implications of these domestic techniques were equally disturbing. If popular manipulation was necessary within states, balance of power politics was essential between states. No single power could be allowed to become so dominant that it could impose its will on all others, but neither could any power be so completely weakened that it ceased to be a factor in international calculations. This led to what Machiavelli called the diplomacy of betrayal. Alliances had to be formed and broken based on strategic calculations rather than moral commitments.
Yesterday's enemy might become today's ally if circumstances changed. Today's ally might become tomorrow's enemy if the balance of power shifted.
The prince who allowed personal feelings or moral principles to interfere with these calculations was not being noble but naive, and his naivety would ultimately harm his own people by weakening their position in an anarchic international system. The most chilling aspect of Machiavelli's analysis was his recognition that these techniques, while morally repugnant to contemplate, were already being employed by successful leaders throughout history. He was not advocating for new forms of evil but documenting existing practices that others preferred to ignore or disguise. The choice was not between moral and immoral leadership but between conscious and unconscious manipulation, between strategic and random application of these techniques. Those who refused to acknowledge the reality of power politics did not thereby escape its operation, they simply ensured that they would be its victims rather than its masters. The prince who maintained moral purity in a corrupt world was like a vegetarian in a pack of wolves. His virtue would not protect him but would simply make him easier prey for those who understood the true rules of the game. In the final analysis, Machiavelli's darkest teachings can be distilled to a single, terrible insight, that human nature contains within itself the seeds of both civilization and barbarism, that the difference between the two is largely a matter of circumstances and social organization, and that those who would preserve civilization must be prepared to employ barbaric methods when necessary. The alternative is not the triumph of virtue but the victory of those who practice vice without admitting it. This recognition leads to what might be called the Machiavellian paradox, that moral leadership in an immoral world requires the willingness to commit immoral acts. The prince who would protect his people must sometimes sacrifice individuals, the leader who would preserve justice must sometimes act unjustly, the ruler who would maintain peace must sometimes wage war. These are not contradictions to be resolved through clever reasoning but tragic necessities to be acknowledged and accepted. The burden of this knowledge is what separates true leaders from mere administrators. Anyone can follow rules and apply principles when circumstances are favorable. But leadership is tested in moments of crisis when all the rules break down, when principles conflict with each other, when the choice is not between good and evil but between different forms of evil. In such moments, the leader who has absorbed Machiavelli's teachings will act decisively while others hesitate, will accept responsibility for necessary evils while others seek excuses, will sacrifice personal virtue for public good while others sacrifice public good for personal virtue. This is the ultimate darkness in Machiavelli's teaching, not that evil exists in the world, but that good people must sometimes do evil things to prevent greater evils from occurring. The prince who refuses to execute traitors may see his state destroyed by treason. The leader who will not use deception in negotiations may find his people enslaved by those who lie more skillfully. The ruler who cannot bring himself to break promises may watch his enemies break them first with devastating effect. Yet Machiavelli's vision was not entirely without hope. He believed that through the conscious application of these dark arts, it might be possible to create islands of stability and prosperity in an ocean of chaos and conflict. The prince who understood human nature could channel its destructive impulses toward constructive ends. The leader who mastered the techniques of power could use them to build rather than merely to destroy. The ruler who accepted the burden of necessary evil could create conditions under which others could live virtuous lives. The tragedy of Machiavellian leadership is that those best suited to wield power are often those least suited to enjoy it. The skills required to gain and maintain authority, cunning, ruthlessness, paranoia, the willingness to sacrifice others for strategic advantage, are precisely the qualities that make personal happiness and genuine human connection nearly impossible. The prince must always be calculating, always watching for betrayal, always prepared to abandon today's ally or destroy yesterday's friend. It is a lonely and corrosive existence, but Machiavelli argued it was the price that must be paid for social order and civilizational achievement. As the candle burned lower on Machiavelli's desk that night in 1513, as he completed the document that would make his name synonymous with political realism and moral compromise, he understood that he was not merely writing a manual for princes but a mirror for humanity itself. The techniques he described, the principles he outlined, the brutal truths he documented, these were not aberrations but revelations of the fundamental nature of human social organization. Every reader who encounters the prince must confront the uncomfortable question of whether Machiavelli was right, whether the world really does operate according to these dark principles, whether the choice really is between conscious manipulation and naive victimhood. The honest reader will find evidence for Machiavelli's observations everywhere: in corporate boardrooms where executives smile while planning layoffs, in political campaigns where candidates promise what they know they cannot deliver, in international relations where treaties are signed with no intention of honoring them when circumstances change. But the same honest reader must also confront the question of whether this reality is inevitable or merely persistent, whether human nature is truly as fixed as Machiavelli believed, whether there might be alternatives to the cycles of deception and betrayal that he documented with such clinical precision. These questions have no easy answers, and perhaps that is Machiavelli's final teaching, that the human condition is fundamentally tragic, caught between aspiration and reality, between what we wish to be and what we are compelled to become. The document he created that night would outlive the principalities he sought to advise, would influence leaders from Napoleon to Kissinger, would be studied in universities and applied in boardrooms, would be both celebrated and condemned across 5 centuries of human history. But perhaps its greatest achievement was not in teaching people how to gain power but in forcing them to acknowledge what power actually costs, not just for those who suffer under it, but for those who must wield it in a fallen world where perfect solutions do not exist and every choice carries within it the seeds of future tragedy. In abandoning fairness and embracing ruthlessness, Machiavelli argued, we do not become monsters but reveal ourselves to be human beings operating in a world where monstrous choices are sometimes necessary. The darkness in his teachings is not the darkness of evil but the darkness of truth, the recognition that civilization is fragile, that order is temporary, and that those who would preserve what is good must sometimes do what is terrible. It is a burden that few are willing to bear and fewer still are capable of bearing well, but it is the burden that leadership has always required and will always require until human nature itself is transformed. This transformation, Machiavelli believed, was not impossible but was certainly not imminent. Until it arrives, his teachings remain as relevant as they were in Renaissance Italy, dark, disturbing, but ultimately necessary truths about the world as it is rather than as we wish it to be. Those who would lead must choose between accepting these truths and being crushed by them, between wielding power consciously and having it wielded against them unconsciously, between embracing the darkness and being consumed by it. The choice, as always, remains ours to make.